Everyone says shoot RAW, but when you dive into the menu, ever notice this setting? Compressed versus uncompressed. What do these options actually mean? Essentially, setting the RAW format to 12-bit, 14-bit, or 16-bit. Most people just set it once and never think about it again. But this one setting quietly changes how your photos behave after you shoot them. Not sharper, not more pro-looking, just how the image responds when you start adjusting it. Today, I'm breaking down what each of these actually does, from 8-bit JPEG to 16-bit RAW, using real files from the Sony A7R4, the Sony A7IV, and the Fujifilm GFX 100. No charts, no overcomplicated diagrams, no complex tech jargons. And at the end, you'll know exactly which one matters and which mostly just sounds good on paper. Let's break this down. When you take a photo, your camera is recording light and color information. Bit depth is simply how fine the information is recorded. Let's simplify this. An 8-bit JPEG is already processed. Data is compressed and is essentially a finished image. You deliver images for print or digital in 8-bit format. It looks good immediately, but what you see is pretty much what you get. There's not much underneath to work with. 12-bit RAW, 68 billion colors. That's an extra 4 bits of data for making adjustments. 14-bit RAW, 4 trillion colors recorded, an extra 6 bits. 16-bit RAW, maximum headroom, a mind-boggling 281 trillion colors recorded, and that sounds like a lot. If only that could be translated into dollars and put into my bank account. To make it even simpler, a JPEG is a baked image. A RAW file is ingredients. The higher the bitrate, the larger the file size, and the camera might slow down in terms of continuous drive rate, and you'll probably need a larger SD card. So let's see some real-world comparisons between these different bit rates. First, let's see JPEGs from these 3 cameras. We will start with underexposure and shadow recovery. These were shot at ISO 100, underexposed by 5 stops. In Capture One Pro, when we drag the exposure and shadow slider up, we can hardly recover any detail. When you shoot JPEGs, all data from the sensor is packed into an 8-bit container with no access, limiting the ability to recover any underexposed detail. Now let's step into RAW, starting with 12-bit on the Sony A7IV. Straight away, the ability to recover shadow details for an underexposed image shoots up, way more than the 8-bit JPEG. Impressed? Now let's see it shot at 14-bit RAW uncompressed. When you compare the 14-bit against the 12-bit, the differences are not as large as compared to the JPEG. The shadows are a little cleaner in the 14-bit image. At ISO 400, something interesting happens. The noise seems a little bit better on the 12-bit image, but look closer and you can see some artifacts here. Even at 2 stops underexposed, the artifacts are still there. Now let's take a look at the 60-megapixel Sony A7R4. At ISO 100, the differences between 12-bit compressed and 14-bit uncompressed doesn't seem very large. Let's switch to ISO 400. Now the difference is clearly visible. Much cleaner noise in the recovered shadows from the 14-bit image. Let's now dive into 100-megapixel 16-bit territory with the Fujifilm GFX 100. The 16-bit image is showing less shadow color shift compared to the magenta tint on the 14-bit image. At ISO 500, the second native ISO of the GFX 100, the 14-bit image is again showing more color shift in the shadows. But the difference between the 16-bit and the 14-bit image is less apparent at ISO 100. Just for fun, let's see the image from the GFX 100 against the Sony A7R4. The medium format sensor is clearly superior in the shadow and noise. Let's now take a look at highlight recovery for overexposed images. For the JPEG versus 12-bit RAW, it's clearly visible in the clouds. The clouds are basically gone in the JPEG. But when we compare 12-bit and 14-bit, I don't see any difference. Likewise, 16-bit versus 14-bit, the higher 16-bit does not show any advantage. How you manage your RAW image is important as well. Let's see a direct comparison between Capture One Pro, Photoshop and Lightroom. we shall first export the unedited 14-bit A7R4 image from Capture One as a 16-bit file and import into Photoshop. In Photoshop, we can clearly see this is a 16-bit file. So let's go ahead and edit it using the Camera Raw filter. Let's slide the exposure slider up to +4 and the shadows up 100. Let's compare the image edited in Capture One Pro against this image we just edited. We can see the colors have changed dramatically. The orange crate and plastic bag have turned red, and the blue crates have turned purple. When we zoom into the dark shadows, we don't have as much details and the shadows have a very heavy blue cast. Let's try and reduce this noise back in Camera Raw. Let's slide the color noise reduction all the way up. Even with the color noise reduction applied, the shadows still have that very heavy blue tint. What about editing the original RAW image directly in Photoshop? Let's try, shall we? Here's the original RAW ARW image in Photoshop. Slide the shadows up +100. When editing RAW images in Photoshop, the exposure slider works a little bit differently. +2.5 here seems to match the 4-stop adjustment in Capture One Pro. Let's compare the Capture One edit and this Photoshop RAW image edit. The Photoshop RAW edit shows a lot more color noise in the shadows. Let's try and denoise the Photoshop RAW file. You can see with the denoise function, the shadows have turned all green. I don't think that's a successful noise reduction. Let's now take a look at Lightroom with the RAW Sony ARW image. Again, let's slide the exposure up to 2.5 and the shadows up +100. Just like Photoshop, the shadows look really noisy. What about denoise? Once again, the shadows have turned green, just like Photoshop. Sliding the denoise slider to max only makes the shadows less detailed and the shadows are still green. So here's my takeaway. The difference between an 8-bit JPEG and any RAW file is huge. The extra data is largely for the shadow areas when you need to recover them from underexposure. The advantage a 14-bit file has over a 12-bit is a lot more evident as compared to 14-bit versus 16-bit. So here's the honest answer. If you're shooting JPEG, get your exposure right in camera. There's not much margin for error. Yes, a 14-bit file is evidently better than a 12-bit. A 16-bit is technically better than 14-bit, but no, it's not twice as good. Drop us a comment below if you have any questions or you have a topic you'd like me to explore. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe below, and I'll see you again next time for more no-fluff video on photography and lighting.